Good morning, afternoon. Good Sunday evening. How about that? Welcome everybody to what is the 36th annual Winter Lecture Series. We now, well, since you clapped for that, I have to tell you we didn't originate it. It started at Vine Congregational Church 36 years ago, and it has been here at the Unitarian Church only since the turn of the century, so for the last 19, 20 years. But we can't claim credit for the origin of it. We now call it the Winter Lecture Series Global Perspectives. But that's a little bit too much, so I always truncate it. Anyway, my name is Dick Dean-Spear. I'm a member of the committee that guides the Winter Lecture Series. The real heavy lifting for the program you're about to see today and for the next 5 weeks was done by David Forsyth and Jack Comer, who are also members of the committee that guides the Winter Lecture Series. You'll hear more from them later as this series goes on. The other people on the committee that deserve some recognition, Chuck and Barb Francis, who play a major role in checking you in, Sherrod Seth, Sate. You don't want to write S-E-T-H and have to pronounce it Sate. But anyway, he's our treasurer. My wife, Karen Dean Spears, on the committee. David Iaquinta is here. Rich Little, Peter Levitov, Brendan Evans, who is doing the recording of this, and we'll put it on the website after a little while so you can see it twice if you want. Beth Ann Brooks, Nancy Comer, along with John, whom I've already mentioned. We are sponsored by the Social Action Committee of the Unitarian Church and by OLLI, the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute. We partner together to present this program. OLLI does an awful lot for us by way of announcing and advertising and so on, and we're very grateful for that. But we're supported financially by Humanities Nebraska. I will read you the note that they like us to read at the beginning of each program, of each season. This program is brought to you by Humanities Nebraska, a statewide nonprofit organization inspiring and enriching personal and public life by offering opportunities to thoughtfully engage with history and culture, with additional funding from the Nebraska Cultural Endowment. If you enjoy this type of programming, please consider supporting Humanities Nebraska with a contribution. Donations are matched by state and federal funds. Your support helps preserve our past and inform our future. The sign-ups are a little bit less than we've had in past years because Humanities Nebraska no longer demands that we send them a list of everybody who came. But if you would like to receive email announcements of future programs, Winter Lecture Series programs, please be sure that you've signed up when you came in, or if you know you're already on the list. Of course, you don't need to, but that'll keep you informed about our future. As I mentioned, we're going to do 6 lectures this year. We did only 5 last, on successive Sunday evenings, so we don't have any time off for Super Bowl or Oscars or other things that are wonderful to do on Sunday evenings. Once the lecture is over each week, within a week or so, Brendan will post it on the website of the Unitarian Church. That's www.unitarianlincoln.org. That's the same website, by the way, that you would wish to go to if it were snowing like the dickens outside and you thought maybe those people will cancel. So if the weather were bad and you needed to find out, then you go to that www.unitarianlincoln.org. You came in down a long hallway. On your way down, you passed a sort of a small hallway off that leads to the restrooms. If you're going to the restrooms from this direction, you take a right halfway down the hallway. You probably all know that parking is available across Eldon Drive from here. In other words, to the west of here, they don't mind that we use that parking lot. So feel free to use that. If you need hearing assistance, we do have some units that you can pick up from whomever is running the booth when you come in. In this case, it's Linda Brown. Thank you, Linda, for coming in and doing that. Cell phones, please silence if you have not already. I'm going to let David Forsyth explain why the topic of Central and South America was thought by us to be particularly relevant this year. And David will introduce our speaker, but first let me just remind you, if you're new to the Winter Lecture Series, that our speaker goes for about an hour. We don't cheat him on the hour by taking up introductory time, but give the whole hour. Then we retreat into the room that has refreshments, or will have refreshments, behind us, and take about 15 minutes, which is enough time to get to know, to see old friends and grab a snack. And at that point, it could be sort of 8:25 or so, we'll come back in here, those people who wish to, which is most people, for a Q&A that will end promptly at 9 o'clock. That's the only time frame that we're serious about, is our ending time. David Forsyth, please introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Dick. It's great to see so many people out tonight. I'd like to make clear at the start that if things go well, I did it, and if things don't go well, Jack Comer did it. We had that division of labor. Some months ago, the entire planning committee was deciding on a subject for the series this winter, and at that time, U.S. relations with Latin America were very much in the news. Perhaps the media coverage has dropped off a little bit. There was this thing called impeachment and tensions with Iran and certain virus from East Asia and all of that. But none of the issues in U.S. relations with Latin America have been resolved. U.S. relations with Mexico. Mexico is under tremendous pressure because particularly of migration from Central America. That's the topic next week. We have a professor coming in from Vanderbilt University to tell us about what's going on in Central America, Honduras, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Guatemala, etc., and why there has been such migratory flow toward the United States. We as a country, the government, we, whoever is very much involved still in Venezuela, where Maduro is still in power and is being contested by forces backed by the United States. If you haven't noticed, Brazil has its own version of Donald J. Trump in Bolsonaro, and we have a speaker on Brazil. I was just in Ecuador a couple of weeks ago and noticed very large percentage of the country being made up of indigenous peoples, and there was a protest in Ecuador. In fact, the government of Ecuador, to avoid the protest in Quito, had to decamp to Guayaquil to be able to function. And we're going to have a speaker on indigenous peoples in Latin America. And so lots of these issues are still very vibrant, even though perhaps not always fully covered by the U.S. media. So I think, if I do say so myself, we made a good choice in focusing on U.S. relations with Latin America. And we have a very good lineup of speakers, I think, tonight and in the coming 5 weeks. We were very delighted to be able to lead off with Tim Borstelmann, distinguished professor of history at UNL. A number of you have heard him speak already in one format or another. We're very happy that UNL was able to steal him away from Cornell University, where he was. He started out doing his studies at Stanford, BA, Bachelor of Arts at Stanford, where he was Phi Beta Kappa. He took his graduate degrees at Duke. He's done a book with Oxford University Press on U.S. relations with Southern Africa during the time of apartheid. He's done a book with Harvard University Press on the U.S., the Cold War, and the color line, meaning race relations, how the Cold War was intertwined with race issues. He's done a book with Princeton University Press looking back at the 1970s. Interesting time. As usual, for a distinguished professor, he's done multiple refereed articles and conference presentations. At UNL, he's won a research award, a teaching award, every award except an Oscar, and maybe tonight, who knows? Could be an Oscar night. And he served as president of the American Society for Historians who study foreign relations. That's not the exact title of the group, but that's close. And he was president of that, which gives you an indication of his status in the profession. So, Tim, we're delighted you were able to do this. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Dave. How we doing, Linda? Does this look like we've got the right, just one mic? If we get two mics, that'll be scary. My wife would say that would be horrifying. That would be doubly amplified. I want you to know the most important thing tonight I did was to make some chicken a la saltimbocca for an early dinner. That was actually the important part of the evening from my household's point of view. You guys are just sort of the extra. But I was looking forward to you, and I'm delighted that you're here. I'm really honored that you're here. Thank you for coming. And thanks today for that nice introduction. It is true that going head-to-head with the Oscars probably isn't the very ideal scenario, you know. My wife likes to remind me of this. She's the one who keeps me humble in the family. You've probably gotten that impression already. And she does this brilliantly by noting that the photo they've been parading around of Brad Pitt from, Once Upon a Time in the West shows that he's in pretty good shape, as well as a pretty handsome dude. And she likes to remind me that he's just 6 years younger than me. She just sort of looks at me and sits there with that. I'm like, oh, okay, thanks. So I resist the J-Lo stuff. It's okay. Well, a little bit. We get. But anyway, I'm honored that you guys are here. I don't really know how much overlap there is. I don't even know if people watch the Oscars anymore. I have no idea, but I'm delighted that you're here with me instead today. It's also fun to be with people who, if you'll pardon me saying so, are kind of my team for the most part. People who kind of remember the 70s maybe, that era that I wrote a book about. Because I spend most of my time when I'm in rooms with people who have no idea what I'm talking about because they're charmingly young. And I love them, and they're the future, and I have great hope for them. But it's fun to occasionally come, deal with people who aren't up until 4 every morning, I hope. And who don't live quite the insane lives that undergraduates do, although I'm very grateful for them tolerating me as much as they seem to so far. It's also true that it's a little embarrassing to be up here. Dave Forsyth, as many of you know, is an extremely distinguished political scientist and expert on U.S. foreign relations as well as international relations more broadly, and particularly on the world of human rights. And to do anything with him here is a little tough. He should be up here. So I'm grateful to him for letting me have a shot at this. And I just want to note that the topic of our series, U.S. and Latin America, it's the subtitle that's always the important thing. You got to remember, focus on the subtitle. Problems and Prospects. And this just rings a bell to me that's so clear because I remember at age 18, getting excited about history courses at Stanford University, and this is a long, long time ago, and several of those courses were labeled things like problems and prospects in, Middle Eastern history, or issues and problems, and I was at a point in my life where I wasn't really interested in problems. I just got to California. Life was pretty good, It was like, I was like, what's the obsession with problems, And it took me a while, before I could really be a history major to kind of get comfortable with the idea that problems, of course, are the places where things don't fit together, right? The cognitive dissonances, the tensions that we have in our lives and in our collective lives as societies and as countries relating to each other. In other words, that's where the interesting stuff is. The other stuff is the stuff we all understand and sort of get along with. So let me try to dig into this problem today, which is the background, the deep background on the United States and Latin America. And I'll just, one last shout out to my wife who said, so you'll start in 1776, right? And I said, she's goading me because, of course, historians, we never start where we're supposed to. We're obsessed with roots, right? I mean, the people who explain why things really are the way they are today are people like Dave. The rest of us, you know, who were hired in from history point of view, we're like, oh yeah, that's really cool. Where did that come from? And then we track that back and we're like, oh, where did that come from? And we're, you know, and we're kind of like, we get lost back in the distant mists of time. So I'm gonna do the big sweep today because I think it's crucial actually to think about how the United States and how American citizens, residents, understand the rest of their hemisphere. How do we think about it collectively? It's a big, long story, and I'll spend at least a good chunk of this time on the pre-US part, before there is a United States. So let's start with Latin America itself. Let's start with defining terms. I mean, what is Latin America? That's a useful place to begin because we think we know what it is, but of course, it's ought to be in quotations, right? Because it's a social construct, as they say in academia, which is a way of saying it can be understood in different ways at different times, depending on who you're talking about. And there's all kinds of implications about who has control of which pieces of it, as well as who has dominance in the discussion of that history and who gets to shape the questions or problems that we talk about. So it's not just sort of South America, because you guys could all go, okay, Panama, South, we could do that. I understand, no argument about that. Well, actually, continents are a little more complicated than we think, but I'm going to resist the geographical history today. But in the case of Latin America, I mean, this is a term that doesn't exist when the United States becomes a country. It's not there. I mean, there's a lot of other terms being used for the places that we think of as part of Latin America. One of them is Hispanic America, which implies the Spanish-speaking places that received independence, that fought for and won their independence with great blood and treasure expended between 1810 and 1823. So that would be a Spanish America. There's also an Ibero-America, which is a way of reminding us that, you know, there's this other part of the Iberian Peninsula called Portugal, and they're actually the people who wound up colonizing and controlling Brazil, which is the largest country in the hemisphere. So Hispanic America is not very useful. Ibero-America is a little better, but of course it leaves out places like Guyana up here, which used to be British Guiana, or French Guiana here, which is still French Guiana, still part of the empire, just in case we thought imperialism was all gone, and Suriname, which is the old former Dutch Guiana. So, I mean, those languages don't quite fit in that perspective, nor of course does Belize up here, which is an English speaking, nor does much of the Caribbean. As you know, Caribbean ranges from Spanish and French through English and Dutch and on into several different Creole versions of those languages. So exactly what's involved is complicated, but the term emerges in the 1840s and 1850s. It's a political term. It's a way of saying to the increasingly powerful and expansive white-run country in the northern part of the hemisphere, the United States, which is thinking of itself as the dominant force in this hemisphere going forward. It's a way of saying to them, we are legitimate too, and we're different than you. We're not just Americans, because that's the other term that people were using in the late 1700s and early 1800s. Because American, you know, as you know, it's a term that's complicated, and we tend to prefer the United States because of all of the hemisphere being thought of as the Americas in many ways. So this is a sort of challenge that they give to an increasingly Anglo-Saxon-minded United States. That is a nation that was imagining its own identity increasingly in racial terms, and in that weird way that race gets socially constructed. Sometimes it's thought of as Nordic white folks. Sometimes they're thought of, that's up here on the map. Sometimes they're thought of as Caucasian. That's down here. See, you know, the Black Sea, or sometimes they're thought of as Aryan in the German case, or sometimes they're thought of, you know, in Anglo-Saxon terms, and that's back up here and over Germany in this area, right? So there are all kinds of complicated ways in which race is imagined. But Americans in the late 1800s were obsessed with, increasingly, with the idea that there was an Anglo-Saxon core to the sort of logic of great empires that were also constitutionally and democratically managed, that the British were the model for this and the United States was going to take over for them. So from the Latin American perspective, this was hardly the whole story, and they objected, of course, and began to refer to themselves as Latin Americans. And in doing so, let's see how this works. Oh, yes, it does work. Good. Okay. In doing so, actually, let me hang on to this slide for one more second, and that is to just remind you that they increasingly use the word Latin America for the very specific way of saying we are the peoples of the hemisphere who speak languages that come from Latin. I mean, it's a Romance language thing, right? Which is Spanish and French and Portuguese and Italian and Romanian. But in this case, it's really about French, because it's a term in the 1850s where the French are the increasingly powerful empire in the region other than the English and the Americans. And it's a way of aligning with the French, trying to get the French, especially Napoleon III, in the 1840s and 1850s, to think positively about Latin America as a place to ally with and be a sort of help against increasing encroachment from the north. So it's a political project to call it Latin America. So now you're never going to use the term again. No, that's not the implication, right? We should have scare quotes on all kinds of things that we use, right? But we don't do that because it slows down. We sort of take these terms as though they are real, but of course they're constructed. So I just offer that to you without wanting to beat that dead horse any further. Done it enough. Of course, Americans have always thought about the areas to the south in the title of this great book by Lars Schultz, a very distinguished University of North Carolina political scientist, expert in this field, as being beneath the United States, which is, that's the way Americans see it, right? I mean, these people are down there. They're down there, right? With all the wonderful implications that carries, right? Of course, that's also a social construction, right? Just so we're clear, and I know it's going to get weird now, okay? So this is an early map. This is a world map by Nicolas Delien for the Usage de la Roi de France, for the French king in 1566. And what it is, of course, is the world. You can tell what it is, right? This is Africa. Upside down. This is Europe upside down. This is Siberia out here. They're a little vague on Australia because they're not in 1560. They're trying to figure out exactly how big Southeast Asia is going to be. They're not sure what's down there. They've sort of heard different reports. And then there's this part over here, which is, of course, that's South America, pointed upwards, upside down. We would call it upside down, right? And then there's this cool little isthmus, and then you got the rest of New Spain up here, and then it kind of comes over here into, it curves toward Europe, and they're not quite sure what's up here. Greenland is pretty small. But, they're piecing it together. They have no idea what the full extent of this continent is in 1566. Now, this map is wrong, of course. It's upside down. Or no, I mean, if you're on Mars, which way is up and which way is down? There's a very distinguished scientist back here. Jim, can I get you to explain? And I'm just teasing you. I want to bring a scientist out to explain. Is this up or is this down? Right? I mean, when you're out in space, neither one's up or down. Thank God for gravity. It's holding us together, right? But so we could be charting the U.S.-Latin American relationship in opposite terms, but it serves our purposes to keep the United States upstairs, right, looking down. So just chew on it. It's the same thing as the Mercator Map Projections that almost all of you, and maybe a few of you are just young enough to not have grown up with these, but those terrible maps where, you take a three-dimensional Earth and you have to put it into two dimensions. So it's like when you peel the tangerine successfully in one peel and smack it against a wall, it looks weird. So, and you got to distort a map to show the world in two dimensions. Right? That's not the only distorted map, right? Every map we use is a distorted map of the globe. And so when you do that, it means that, the Mercator projection is the classic imperialist northern hemisphere projection that says, look, the hemisphere is big up here and the one down below is tiny. Greenland is bigger than Africa. It's that, and it has a political meaning to it. It's saying, look at us. This is where stuff happens. It doesn't happen down there. Okay. I'm sure that I've more than made my point here. but anyway, here's another map of Latin America to think about in terms of defining Latin America. And you can see just how it's defined by the Andes mountain range, which is rather dramatic, up to well over 20,000 feet down here in Chile and up into Peru and the edges of Bolivia and Ecuador and on up to Colombia. And so you can see the Amazon River drainage here, this amazing basin that defines the northern half of Latin America, and of course the the La Plata, the river here, that is a combination of 3 other rivers flowing together at Buenos Aires down here, which defines the sort of agricultural areas of the southern half of the hemisphere, of that part of our hemisphere. So this is another way to think about it. Here, what else do I have? Oh, and then you can see the whole thing, of course, in comparison with North America, and just how much the mountain chains on the western side are really defining of the characteristic of both parts of the hemisphere. Okay. So that's what it looks like. So there's a lot of different ways to think about it. One other way, maybe just to make it clear, is that Americans today still think of Latin Americans as sort of a race of people, you know, which confuses a lot of people, including Latin Americans, who really are like, wait a minute, we're not all sort of a single race. Then racial categories are problematic, but the best way to see this in simple terms is to think about the US Census, because they're the people who try to count us, and they're doing it this year, right? And one of the ways they try to count us is by ethnicity and religion, et cetera, and race, right? And their racial categories have changed over the decades as they've figured out the truth. No, it's not the truth. They figured out the way we want to think about it this decade, right? So that nowadays, in 1980 or is it 2000? Somebody can correct me on this. Somewhere in the last 20 years of the last century was when they decided to allow Latinos, Hispanic Americans, to be of white or non-white, right? That became an ethnicity rather than a racial category. So you could be Latino white, you could be Latino not white. And then, but of course, that raised all kinds of interesting questions about why can't you be Italian white and Italian non-white? Because I don't know if anyone has seen the terrific new television series of the popular Italian novel, My Brilliant Friend, by Elena Ferrante, one of the bestsellers in Europe in the last 10 years. And they have this wonderful cast of Italians, and what you see immediately as soon as you go down the street in these it looks just like the diversity of Latin America. The ratio, that sort of ethno-racial diversity of people who look like they could be in Sweden or look like they could be, you know, in an indigenous community in Alaska, you know, all these places in between. I mean, it's an amazing sort of diversity. But we think Italians, they're just white. Well, we didn't always think that. Back in the 1800s, it's being worked out. There's this big division between Northern Italians and Southern Italians. And in the 1870s and 80s and 90s, the best American scientists thought there were 2 races of Italians. There were Southern Italian, the Southern Italian race, and the Northern Italian race. So anyway, it's complicated is the point. And Latin America has precisely that sort of diversity. Okay, how did the rest of the world, though, first understand this region? Let's consider this map. Just to remind us that, you know, human migration comes out of Central Africa, East Central Africa here, roughly 200,000 years ago. And essentially the simple version of world history is that they come out, I told you we were going to get back before 1776, right? And you're all still with me, right? But essentially the simple version of this is that that Homo sapiens came out of Africa across what is today the Suez Canal, because there wasn't a canal yet, and they turn left and become Europeans, or they turn right and become Asians, essentially, over time. And then the Asians wind up, some of them out here in Siberia, and wind up crossing over the land bridge at Beringia into, you know, the strait, what is today the Bering Sea, and peopling the rest of the Americas here, right? So, I mean, this is the full sweep of it. This is a simple way of saying that the first Latin Americans are from Asia, I guess, if you want to think of it, right? So, or that we're all Africans is the other way to put it, right? That Africans, who are the great receivers of the boot heel of modern imperialism, are, of course, in a long, serious genetic sense, the greatest imperialists of all, right? I mean, because we're all African. You can pretend we're not if you don't want to, whatever. Okay, so, but what happens is for Europeans, as they begin by the 1300s, and particularly the 1400s, to poke around the edges of the known world, to explore by sea the Atlantic Ocean, the Ocean Sea, to begin to trade with and begin to go into war with various peoples on the West African coast and begin to take the first African slaves who come back into Europe. And as they trade, following Marco Polo's heritage across here to China, they come to see the world by the 1480s as a place that's spherical. They have understood that the world is round, and that eventually you should be able to go that way and wind up over here, right? And this is what Columbus does, eventually. And he takes these voyages with a whole lot of other people who accompany him and do the work with him. And they do these voyages and, you know, connect the 2 hemispheres in the 1490s, early 1500s. And what this leads to is this map, a Dutch map of the 1730s. This was the clearest one I could get, but you could get versions of this like the Nicolas Delien map, but the right side up. right? You know, so here it is. And you can see the great part about this is that, you know, of course, this is mystery land up here. You know, Amazon and Jeff Bezos. It can't even be imagined. It's Starbucks. Can't even imagine it yet. Much less Alaska. And what's her name? Sarah Palin. Can't imagine Sarah Palin yet. How about that? History without Sarah Palin. So this is a nice audience. I can say that sort of thing. People laugh, you know. If I say that to some of my friends who are like serious, you know, the hardcore Republicans who I have sort of close friends, they're like, bad joke, don't talk about her. Okay, so, but the key here, what I really want to suggest is that there is, crossing the Atlantic and crossing the mid-Atlantic ridge, not the Viking version 500 years earlier, which didn't last and didn't lead to, you know, a permanent set of settlements, but the one that follows Columbus, which leads to the development of the Americas as the modern set of nation states that they become. It's like the discovery of a second Earth. It's a one-time experience in human history. It's never going to happen again, right? I mean, there is no third Earth to go discover. But the scope of this wasn't known. I mean, they're trying to figure out, where are we? Columbus goes to his grave thinking that he was off the islands off Japan, right? I mean, they're not at all sure. So this has to get pieced together. So we've got, you know, you got 200 more years here, 238 more years to figure out enough of this to realize that this land, with all these people there, all these indigenous folks who were dying because mostly of the European diseases, unintentionally brought and shared, along with some warfare on top of it, but about 95% of the deaths come largely from disease, that these incredibly rich, lush lands are just there for the taking. It's like Christmas. I mean, it's the mall is open and the cashiers are gone and just come on in. I mean, I don't know how to, I can't even think. There's so many analogies. It'd make me crazy trying to think about them all. But it's a spectacle of availability. I was going to say it's a spectacle of greed, but you can see it as just people, you know, and being offered apparently available land with very few people in it, relatively speaking. And they have all kinds of ways of, you know, discounting the people who are there or killing the ones who really become problematic. So anyway, the point is, for our purposes, is that this discovery, as you'll see here, is that South America and what becomes Latin America is more important and earlier known than the rest. Right? The American version of this is always, what happens up here? Get me to Plymouth, get me to Virginia, damn it, and don't give me that St. Augustine and, you know, Santa Fe stuff, you know, and don't talk about Quebec. And I mean, come on, I want Puritans and I want Cavaliers, you know. I don't want Cavaliers. I grew up as a Duke basketball fan. That means Virginia. I'm not a fan of those. Okay. So this is a very distinctive, amazing experience that happens once in human history, the discovery of a second. Or sometimes with my students who grew up on Harry Potter, I'll use the reference of the analogy of, what's the track 9 3/4? What is that right? Yeah. I mean, you know, the whole idea that there's this thing you don't know is there. But it's not just a little track in a huge station. It's half the Earth. Man, I'll take just a block on the ridge. Get me a block on the ridge and I'm set for life, you know, it's amazing. Okay, so here's an English map earlier just to give you a sense of just how unknown the Northwest and the North Country is. So this really helps you see that from an early European point of view, Latin America is where the action is, right? I mean, if you told them Latin America is not going to be all that important, it's going to be down there beneath the United States, that's where the action is going to be, they would have said, you're nuts. And the reason is because they're going to find all kinds of very valuable things in this place that they reached first and knew the best, which is the Caribbean and South America here and Mexico here. Okay. So here you can see the Spanish and the Portuguese exploring out into this region. They're the earliest imperialists, partly because of their geography, right? I mean, they're on the Iberian Peninsula, so they're furthest out in the water. They're closest to Africa, so there's a whole set of connections and trading and slaving expeditions. Some of it is cultural. I mean, that they're open to and interested in the expansion of the Catholic faith and the desire to spread that faith around the globe. So they're busy exploring across the world here. And you can see that includes also Magellan's trip out here in the 1520s, 1519 to 1523, which is going to include, here you can see it, coming to the Philippines, and he actually dies in the Philippines, but the rest of some of his crew finishes the first circumnavigation of the globe. Okay, now, what the Spanish and the Portuguese also do is go to war with each other. They kill each other in large numbers, and they figure out the way imperialists do and large powers do how to sort of divide things up. And they use a little papal assistance on the diplomatic front to create this Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494. And essentially the Portuguese are kept on one side, the Spanish are kept on the other. But you'll see that the line actually is going to move considerably. Brazil's going to get a lot bigger, and it's going to be more of an even Steven sort of combination or sharing between the two powers here. Okay, and here we go. Yeah. So you can see also where they go first. Remember how remote British territory is. I'm the only person you're going to listen to in this series who's not a Latin American expert, right? And so I'm going to be here I'm talking about Latin America as though I know anything about it. It's kind of funny, but I mean, that's a little too hard on myself. But you get the. But in other words, this is the world I know more about up here. But it's like Americans generally, not just me. It's way remote. It's off in our story for this purposes of this series. It's really it's a minor distraction up there for the first couple of centuries. It's just a bunch of relatively poor English settlers trying to figure out how to make a farm work. Meanwhile, the big money, the big investment, the Silicon Valley of the 1500s is not in North America. It's down here. It's in Potosi, right? It's the silver mines of Potosi. Or it's also the silver mines up here of Guanajuato, which is just north of Mexico City. So it's New Spain, it's Peru, and the Rio de la Plata. These are the places of extraordinary wealth for silver and also for gold mining. And of course, what's going to happen soon after that, and already there you'll see this pattern being played out, is the development of slavery. And the development of slavery is going to be a key piece of this, of course. And it's going to happen on primarily the sugar islands, where African slavery is going to really take effect and become a really extraordinarily powerful force in the rest of world history, especially in Western Hemisphere history. But the key, most valuable land in all of the Caribbean, and here you should have your, I don't know, your modern sort of tourist hat on. You're thinking, where do they say? They go to St. Nevis, they go to Kitts. People have their favorite islands, right? But actually, in the 1600s, 1500s, the key here is who can produce the most sugar. These are islands that develop spectacular amounts of sugar cane production. And sugar cane production is so important, and the way you know that is try to think about your life without sugar. Take 5 seconds to think about your life without sugar. Delete. Right? And you're like, man, I'm obsessed with honey. Or whatever, molasses, or in other words, it becomes so much a part of and so inexpensive as a part of our lives. But at this time, it's just being developed as a large-scale thing that can be available to people who are non-elites, who are not spectacularly wealthy in Europe. And it's being done really on the island of Hispaniola, one of Columbus's first stopping points. And it's in what we call Haiti today, but what then was known as Saint-Domingue, the French colony of Saint-Domingue. For the English, this was particularly Jamaica was the heart of their slavery system and sugar production. Also Cuba for the Spanish, as well as Puerto Rico, were all sugar islands. I mean, there's a lot of sugar grown in here. But the key places really are Jamaica and particularly Haiti. Saint-Domingue, it's the wealthiest place on the hemisphere. So we go from gold and silver to sugar production. It's also true that you're going to get sugar production down here in northeastern Brazil as well, as another significant element in that. And eventually, plantation slavery is going to be further developed as a southeastern American phenomenon, and will blow up from that into by far the most self-sustaining, largest slave society in world history. I mean, the U.S., this is it. We're number one. Yeah, definitely number one when it came to producing a self-sustaining plantation slavery system. But it took until the 1800s for that to happen. It took until cotton took off much later. That's not early what's going on. Now, the labor system, as I suggested, is primarily developed out of the African slave trade. It doesn't start there. The first people enslaved, of course, are indigenous peoples who are close by. They're the first workers who can be put in chains and forced to work. And the problem is that they resist, and they run away, and they have easy access, if they can get away, to the neighboring towns of those they've grown up on. It's familiar terrain to them. It's easy for them to get away. And their resistance is largely successful. Europeans, of course, come and work in indentured fashion, unfree labor for 7 years, 10 years, depending on the relationship they had to the people who paid for their voyage over. So there's a lot of unfree European labor too, but the bulk of this ultimately is going to be done by enslaved Africans, who turn out to be the best source in a sort of pure economic sense. And what's interesting in these numbers, if you look at them, is that what I'm suggesting about the relative non-importance of North America is particularly clear. Right. In other words, the slave trade is not focused on the American Southeast. That's a minor little side piece of what is primarily aimed here, but especially by the 1700s in the map on the right, aimed into the Caribbean Sea and these sugar islands. That's where the action really is. And you're going to have eventually 12.5 million, give or take a few, that's the best estimate we have, people taken from Africa and enslaved across the waters in the Americas. Okay, now, it is true, though, that these other folks do catch up, these other Europeans, these other empires, not just the Spanish and the Portuguese. They get the early jump and develop Latin America for us. But these other people come along and catch up as best they can. And the next people in are the French. And I've jumped a little bit too far here because I've gotten you to the 1750s and 1760s. But the French do the exploring and the seizing of territory up the St. Lawrence River, which is spectacularly wealthy, into the Great Lakes in another form of natural resource, which were animal skins and furs, particularly the beaver trade, right? And again, you have to think, okay, before we had labels on everything that were made in China and could go to the mall and have clothes so easily, the idea of warm clothes that had, sort of a distinguished look to them was extraordinarily valuable. So this became an amazing source of wealth for the French, who stayed up there in part also to stay away from the Spanish, because the Spanish had by far the largest navy and the largest military force, and they were the most dangerous, as the French learned in lots of encounters with them. So there's a way in which the English and the Dutch, and you remember that the Dutch are the ones who are going to settle New York, they're going to call it New Amsterdam for the 60 years until the English defeat them in war. The English and the Dutch, for a brief period of time, are actually going to kind of get the leftovers. They get the scraps. I mean, that's the fun thing about it. They get sort of everything that the French don't get to, don't bother with. It's not as wealthy, it's not as affluent. And they don't, and that the Spanish and the Portuguese have left to the north. There are fewer immediate riches in what becomes the United States. But maybe the other way to think about this is that in terms of long-term wealth, the productivity of the soil and the temperature range, the temperate zone, those turn out to be spectacularly important, especially when you include this expansion westward, which I'll come back to in a minute, which develops this whole Mississippi River basin, and Nebraska, which becomes, of course, a central part of the breadbasket of North America, which is in many ways the breadbasket of the world. Spectacularly fertile soil that's going to be found across that river valley. And the United States is going to wind up having that fall into its lap as it expands to the westward. Okay. Now, the American Revolution, of course, and I said we would get here. I promised it, and we did. It's not even 8 yet. This is good. And the American Revolution is a story you know a good bit about, and you can see the sort of scope by which the United States has expanded by 1783 at the end of the Revolution, once it signs the Treaty of Paris, the peace treaty with the British at the end. And what unfolds on here, as you can see, is that by the removal of the French, who were defeated in the 7 Years' War that precedes the American Revolution, we called it well, we weren't there. Americans at the time called it the French and Indian War. So from the 1754 essentially up to 1763, when George Washington got his first licks in as a soldier, as a young officer. That war had led to the French defeat and the French withdrawal from most of North America, essentially. They'd kept a couple little islands up here, Saint-Pierre and Miquelon, as sort of bases for fishing operations, which is tells you another key resource that the French and the British were competing for, which was the cod fishing industry, which was unbelievable, the density of it off these banks, the banks off of Newfoundland and Nova Scotia. This was a source of extraordinary wealth at the time, which has largely been fished out now, but it's still productive, just not the same level or same extent. So you have these 13 British colonies who secede, who create this new nation. They don't take Canada with them, despite their best efforts. They don't take the British Caribbean with them. Jamaica doesn't go, Barbados doesn't go, right? The Americans very much hoped that they would win all of the English colonies, but they only get some of them. And the War of 1812 is essentially a sort of second round of the American Revolution to sort of establish that the British absolutely have to respect American sovereignty, at least to the point of no longer seizing American sailors and sticking them on British ships and making them sail for the Queen, or the King at that point, because the Americans sounded like they were English. There's a little problem with the language, see, they hadn't quite developed. Our nice nasal accents, which make us sound non-British. I know we think the British have an accent, but of course we're the ones with the accent, right? And that accent has to develop over time, right? And at the time of the Revolution, you can't hear the British coming, right? Because we are British. We sound like them, right? So there's a kind of way in which it's a little different than we imagine it as being sort of opposing forces with each other. Okay, now I'll come back to language again. We're not done with language, I promise. The other key revolution that unfolds is the one in Haiti that overthrows slavery, that follows the French Revolution, inspired by the French Revolution. It's enslaved peoples rising up and creating an independent nation, which is then quickly repressed in every possible way by all its powerful neighbors, who all have slaves and desperately want the good news of liberation that comes out of the island of Hispaniola not to come anywhere near Louisiana. Right, or anywhere near Florida or Georgia or South Carolina. So but that is a hugely influential force that suggests that the American Revolution is just the first step on the road to real national liberation for all peoples. It's a big, complicated story. This is going to continue in the case of the Spanish and Portuguese colonies. And you can see this as you get the development of independence in these two decades, the 1810s and the 1820s. This is an amazing, complicated, long story of Latin American independence and the movements for that and the degrees of force that had to be used for that. They are following in the tradition of what the United States has done. The U.S. set the model for this. And the U.S. is busy cheering for this set of independences, partly because it means economic opportunities for the U.S., to be an important force trading with these peoples who will now be independent of Madrid and independent of Lisbon. But it also means that for Americans, it feels like it's an affirmation that this is what the United States is. It's about people determining their own future. And now look, the whole hemisphere is doing it. It's this, in 1776, having a republic, self-government, this was a crazy idea. This was downright Jacobin, or Bolshevik, we would call it. This is communist. This is like, wait a minute, this is too radical, right? So from the perspective of the Europeans, their view of the Americans is that these people are dangerous radicals. Tom Paine and all this overthrowing monarchy, getting rid of hierarchy. Next thing they do is they won't worship God anymore. And after that, my God, they'll probably let women vote. I mean, eventually. I mean, things are, let slaves be free. I mean, you never know where the logic of egalitarianism, when it starts spinning, is very hard to stop. And so it keeps spinning in the Americas, inspired by the U.S., absolutely, but fought out in their own ways and across their own history here. Now, the American sense of camaraderie is important, though, because it suggests a moment in the 1830s and 1840s in particular, where the United States imagines itself as the leader of a whole bunch of independent republics, that the Western Hemisphere is a new world, not just like new world discovered by sailors who didn't know about it, but new world like we're not going to set up hierarchical societies. There's this incredible sense of possibility here that's not going to last. Instead, the United States, as it expands its own empire, is going to come to see these peoples as not worthy, not following the American model. They're a little too Catholic. They didn't get rid of that. That's part of it. That's kind of blind obedience to somebody in Rome. I mean, that just bothers. The Americans are Protestants. They're so Protestant up through the across the 1800s, well into the 1900s, before they even begin to think of Catholics as completely normal Americans. So there's a shift here, a moment of opportunity that I think it's worth just identifying here, at least briefly. And of course, this is that same pattern. You can see the independence of these regions and Americans paying a lot of attention to it. You can also see that what happens is the United States has expanded out by the end of the War of 1812, has expanded out, and with France gone, there's no buffer zone anymore, right? I mean, what's next to it is New Spain, and then that's now becomes Mexico. So the U.S. and Latin America are now cheek by jowl. There's not that sense of, well, we'll kind of do our own thing separately. The temptation is going to get very clear and very sweet to a lot of aggressive American explorers and military people, as we'll see. The Monroe Doctrine, 1823, is the one thing you'll all remember from somewhere in high school. You were abused with this idea. James Monroe, who's the president elected in 1816, serves from 1817 to 1825. This is a declaration which is, it's kind of a hope more than a doctrine. Doctrines are never declared as doctrines, right? They never say, this is my doctrine. Truman never said, this is the Truman Doctrine. Nixon never said this. These are the terms we put on them later. But what this is a reference to Monroe's declaration that the Europeans should consider colonization in the Western Hemisphere to be a historical phenomenon, and that it doesn't happen anymore. We're free of that now. And you can see that. We've all got our independence, essentially. A few Caribbean islands are still not a part of the empires, but there's no more colonization, no new colonization. Now, the U.S. does not have the ability to enforce the Monroe Doctrine. That's why I said it's an aspiration, or it's a hope. The key is that the British are willing to sort of go along with this. And the British have the biggest navy in the world. In the 1800s, the British Navy is equivalent to the U.S. Air Force after 1940 as the dominant way to project military force around the globe. And it's hard to recapture that because we tend to think of navies, and here I'm going to unintentionally kind of insult somebody who's a Navy veteran. I don't mean to do that. But we tend to collectively think of navies as a little old school, kind of like, they go kind of slow, don't they? Why wouldn't you just fly over them with bombers or, attack with various airplanes? But in this era, they are the airplanes. This is how you project power. And so the British are willing to go along with this because the British want to keep other Europeans out of the region that they are now the most important investor in after the Spanish and Portuguese leave with independence. It's only going to be by 1904 when Teddy Roosevelt is president. He declares what becomes known as the Roosevelt Corollary. He doesn't call it that either. He doesn't use the word corollary. Somebody else says, oh yeah, this is sort of a corollary. It connects to the Monroe Doctrine. It says not only should the Europeans stay out, but we, the Americans, only in 1904, with now a large Navy and a growing Army capacity as well, only now will the United States in 1904 begin to enforce the Monroe Doctrine, begin to say we will be a police force throughout the hemisphere. That's really the key shift here. Okay. Now, what you get after this, of course, is the development of an American empire across the country, a transcontinental empire of extraordinary breadth. It's a westward expansion that Americans at the time, from the 1840s onwards, like to refer to as manifest destiny, which is another one of those words you want to use in quotations, because whether or not it was manifest, obvious, that it was the destiny, i.e. divinely inspired or at least inspired by history, even if you wanted a sort of a secular version of it. The idea was that the United States was bound for, and there was no way to stop it from getting to the Pacific, and that the 49th parallel and the Rio Grande and then that funny little desert border across to San Diego, that was just in the cards, That was already designed. It wasn't exactly the 11th commandment, but Americans acted like it was something like that. This is a book, though, that just came out a year and a half ago by a good pal of mine at Northwestern University, very distinguished, very smart young historian, Daniel Immerwahr, How to Hide an Empire. And what I love is how he uses on the cover what he calls the logo map. The one that we're all used to, this map of the lower 48, which to us just feels like about as natural as it comes. I mean, of course this is what the United States is, but it wasn't destined to be this way. It's a product of warfare and diplomacy and settlement and negotiations and a lot of killing and a lot of careful use of land, and it's a complicated story. And what he reminds us of with the rest of this is what's peeking out from behind the logo map, which are all these terrifically large territories. Alaska is particularly huge, of course, and the Philippines as well, which are parts of, as well as Hawaii and all the rest of it, which are a vast set of overseas territories that Americans don't tend to think of as really quite fully American. I mean, I guess Alaska, but it's connected to Canada, so that's sort of say. Hawaii, they sort of let that go. But the rest of it feels like the Samoa, Puerto Rico, the Northern Mariana Islands. In other words, there's a whole sort of long development of this empire that Americans have complicated feelings about it. Sometimes historians will refer to this as a kind of anti-colonial imperialism. or a colonial anti-imperialism. I mean, you can sort of see it either way. In other words, that they don't want to settle things and annex them and run them like the British did Kenya or India. They did that, the U.S. does that with the Philippines from 1898 to 1946 and decide that it's not really the most productive way to manage American interests in the world. But Americans have huge and expanding interests around the globe, right, as well as across the continent. So that's what's going on here. And this development of an empire, you know this story of the expansion and the purchasing from France, who had briefly taken it back from Spain, the Louisiana Territory, the taking of Texas here and on out with the war with with Mexico, the negotiations over the Oregon Territory, which used to go all the way up here into what is British Columbia today. I wish they'd gotten British Columbia. I love British Columbia. I would have been a 54-40 fight guy. No, I'm just kidding. But that was a lot of Americans were like, wait a minute, we should get the whole thing. Why are you negotiating with those British people? We already beat them twice in war, didn't we? Or kind of twice. Andrew Jackson smacked him in New Orleans after a tie. You know, sort of like the tie game is called a tie, and then you run the ball for a touchdown at the end. It's kind of a weird thing that happens at the end of the War of 1812. But in other words, Americans are feeling pretty full of themselves by the 1840s with this story of filling out an expansive transcontinental empire. It's also an empire that's built on cotton, and I think you can see this here. The expansion of slavery to the west starts. Slavery is primarily a phenomenon of what we might think of as the mid-Atlantic colonies in the Mid-Atlantic states, down through the Piedmont region. You could think of this as the Atlantic Coast Conference. No, not anymore. God, they're all weird now. They got Boston and Miami and that. I'm trying to, sports analogies. How could this work with the Sunday night crowd? You're not even watching the Oscars. I'm sorry, this is really, that's bad. But you've heard of these, maybe you've heard of these. Anyway, the main thing is that there's a huge expansion across, I'll do it anyway. The Southeast Conference, this territory down here, what was then the Southwest, Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia, et cetera, out here to Texas. And this is what you see by 1860 is the expansion westward. Oh dear, is that a bad sign? Oh, thank you, it's back. That means that I was about to do something wrong, I think. So I'm glad I've been corrected there. Let's leave this alone. Okay, but you can see just how expansive this is and how it brings, what happens, of course, is that this area which had been under, here you're in 1819, and what